Get
It
off my
started
property!
as a simple
Hey,
Saturday
outside!
afternoon, burgers
This is a
sizzling on
public
the grill,
easement.
kids laughing in the backyard, and the smell of barbecue drifting through the cul-de-sac. But within minutes, that peaceful weekend turned into a neighborhood scandal that nobody saw coming. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't disturbing anyone. Yet the HOA President stormed onto my property, clipboard in hand, claiming our family BBQ violated community decorum. At first, I thought it was a joke until he started taking photos, threatening fines, and sending official notices to every house on the street. What he didn't know was that his own secrets were about to surface, and the same rules he used to humiliate others would soon destroy his own reputation, because in this neighborhood, the loudest enforcer of the rules had the darkest violations of all. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just ruin a barbecue. It ended his career in front of everyone. But how did a simple BBQ expose an entire web of lies? Before everything unraveled, our neighborhood looked like the kind of place people dreamed of, living in: manicured lawns, neatly painted fences, kids riding bikes on quiet streets, and that calm, picture-perfect silence that made it feel safe. My family had moved there 3 years earlier. We weren't the wealthiest or the most involved, but we were content. My wife loved tending the small vegetable garden by the porch. My son spent his weekends building forts under the oak tree. And I worked long hours but always looked forward to Saturday barbecues, the one time the whole family could just breathe. Our cul-de-sac was a tight circle of 10 houses, each one nearly identical in design but vastly different in personality. There was Mrs. Daniels, the retired teacher who always baked cookies for new families, the Millers, who threw block parties every summer, and then there was Richard Collins, the HOA President. Richard wasn't just another neighbor. He was the kind of man who measured his self-worth by how many warning letters he sent out each month. He wore the title of HOA President like a badge of honor, walking the neighborhood clipboard in hand, scanning for violations no one else could see. At first, I didn't think much of him. Every community had a rule enforcer, someone who cared too much about fence height or paint shades. But over time, Richard's rules began to feel less about community harmony and more about control. It started small, a note about our trash bins being visible from the street, even though everyone's were. Then a written warning about a non-compliant lawn chair color that apparently disrupted the neighborhood's visual unity. Most neighbors grumbled privately, but nobody challenged him. Richard liked to remind people that the HOA's authority was legally binding, a phrase he used like a weapon. Still, I tried to keep the peace. We paid our dues on time, followed the guidelines, and stayed out of politics. But something about our family seemed to bother him more than the rest. Maybe it was because we didn't attend his mandatory community socials. Or maybe because we didn't decorate our house according to the HOA's seasonal theme. Whatever it was, he made sure to remind us that our compliance was under review. I brushed it off until that spring, the weekend we planned a small family barbecue to celebrate my wife's birthday. We invited a few friends, kept it quiet, nothing extravagant. I even checked the HOA handbook to make sure outdoor cooking wasn't restricted. It wasn't the morning of the BBQ. The sun came out early and the neighborhood felt alive. I could hear lawnmowers buzzing, sprinklers clicking, and the faint echo of kids playing down the street. For once, I felt proud of what we built, our home, our family, our little piece of peace. But as the grill started to smoke and laughter filled the backyard, I saw him, Richard, standing at the edge of my fence, arms crossed, face twisted in disapproval. His eyes lingered on the grill, the decorations, and the small crowd of neighbors who'd stopped by to say hello. At that moment, something shifted. It was the first time I realized this wasn't just about community rules. This was personal. The next morning, an envelope appeared in our mailbox, stamped with the HOAS emblem and marked urgent. Inside was a formal violation notice accusing us of unauthorized use of outdoor equipment and causing olfactory disturbance. That's when I knew. Our peaceful neighborhood was about to turn into a battlefield, because what started as a simple family barbecue would soon expose everything Richard had been hiding behind that polished HOA title. And before it was over the same clipboard he used to control others would become the very thing that destroyed him.
The first violation letter was annoying, but I didn't think much of it. Most people who lived under an HOA had at least one at some point. I figured it was Richard being his usual self, maybe trying to remind everyone who was in charge. But 2 days later, another letter came. Then another. Each one sounded more official, more threatening, and more absurd. Repeated non-compliance with community decorum. Failure to obtain prior approval for outdoor gatherings. Use of unsanctioned cooking appliances. It was like he'd taken our Saturday barbecue and turned it into a criminal case. I tried reasoning with him, sent an email, explaining that we'd followed every guideline, even attached a photo of the HOA's own rule book showing that outdoor cooking wasn't restricted. His reply came within an hour. Rules are subject to board interpretation. Please cease all non-compliant activities immediately. That's when I realized this wasn't about the barbecue anymore. Richard was using the HOA as his personal weapon, and my family had become his favorite target. Soon, little things around the neighborhood started to change. Our recycling bins were mysteriously moved to the middle of the street. Someone left a printed notice on our car windshield. Parking in front of your own driveway is prohibited. HOA board. The same notice wasn't given to anyone else. Neighbors who used to wave from across the street suddenly avoided eye contact. Some even stopped attending the weekly meetups at the park. It felt like we'd been marked, labeled troublemakers for daring to stand up for ourselves. Still, I tried to keep calm. My wife reminded me, he's just a bully with a clipboard. Don't stoop to his level. And she was right, at least for a while. But the next week, things escalated. Richard sent an official letter claiming that our property would be subjected to a mandatory inspection for potential non-compliance. When I asked what that meant, he simply said, "We've had complaints." I asked who complained. He said it was confidential. When the inspection day came, I watched from my porch as Richard and 2 board members walked around my yard, pointing at random things, my son's basketball hoop, the garden trellis, even our mailbox. They scribbled notes like inspectors at a crime scene. By the time they left, I felt sick. That evening, another envelope appeared. This one came certified. Inside was a detailed list of violations: chipped paint on the fence, improperly stored garden equipment, unauthorized structural modifications, which turned out to be a flower box my wife had installed years ago. The letter ended with a bold line at the bottom. Failure to correct these violations within 14 days will result in daily fines of $250 and potential lien placement. I stared at that sentence for a long time. A lien. Over a flower box. That's when I decided I wasn't going to let this go. I started digging. First, I requested the HOA's financial records, something every member had a legal right to see. Richard ignored my email. I sent another. Still nothing. When I finally brought it up in a public meeting, he smiled and said, "The board has decided that information is sensitive and not subject to release." That was a lie, and I knew it. So I went to the county office. With a few signatures and a small fee, I requested the HOA's annual filings. And that's when things got interesting. The HOA's maintenance budget had ballooned by over 40% in just 1 year, yet the neighborhood hadn't seen a single improvement. No new landscaping, no repaired fences, not even repainted curbs. Where was the money going? The more I read, the more it smelled like corruption. Then, one evening, while scrolling through old community newsletters, I found something buried in plain sight. A line in a March bulletin announcing that the HOA had partnered with a local event management company to host community parties and fundraisers. The company's name, Collins Property Events. Richard's last name was Collins. I looked it up. The business was registered under his wife's name, but the contact email matched the one Richard used for HOA correspondence. He'd been funneling HOA funds into his own family's side business, using community events as a cover. That's when everything clicked. The fines, the threats, the intimidation, it was all about control. Anyone who questioned him risked being silenced with penalties. Anyone who stayed quiet stayed safe, but I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. I started documenting everything, every letter, every email, every notice. I even began recording HOA meetings. What I discovered over the next few weeks made my blood boil. Richard had been using HOA funds to pay for his own catered parties, calling them official gatherings. He billed the HOA for food, decorations, and even private security, all through his wife's company. When a few neighbors privately confronted him, they suddenly found themselves hit with mysterious violations too. It wasn't just me anymore. One night, my neighbor, Mrs. Daniels, the retired teacher, came to my door with trembling hands. She'd received a letter stating her garden gnome violated aesthetic uniformity. It sounded ridiculous, but the fine was real. She whispered, "He's punishing anyone who talks to you." That's when I knew I couldn't fight him alone. I reached out to a few neighbors I trusted, the Millers, the Garcias, and a quiet couple down the street who'd once been lawyers. We started meeting secretly on Friday nights away from the HOA clubhouse. I shared everything I'd found, the financial discrepancies, the shell company, the fake violations. At first, they were skeptical, but when I showed them the documents, their faces changed. The evidence was undeniable. We decided to act. Our plan was simple: expose Richard using his own system. Every HOA event required photos and receipts to be archived for record-keeping. So we attended his next community gathering, pretending to play along. It was a spring mixer hosted, of course, by Collins Property Events. While Richard made his usual speech about community integrity, I noticed something: the invoices laid out on the table beside the guest list. One of them listed a $2,800 catering charge for food from a restaurant that was clearly much cheaper. I took a picture. Then another. Over the next 2 weeks, our small group collected enough evidence to fill a binder. Bank transfers, duplicate invoices, signatures that didn't match. It was a pattern of embezzlement hiding in plain sight, but we needed one final piece: proof that Richard had personally authorized the payments. That's when fate intervened. The HOA sent out a flyer announcing its annual President's Appreciation Party, hosted at Richard's home. It was supposed to be an invite-only event for board members and select residents, meant to celebrate another successful year of leadership. We all knew what that meant: another self-funded party paid for with community money. And this time, it would be his downfall. We quietly coordinated with a local news contact, a reporter who'd previously covered HOA corruption cases. She agreed to attend undercover, posing as a community relations consultant. Meanwhile, I'd bring copies of our evidence and present them to the full board during the next public meeting, scheduled 2 days after his party. The plan was risky. If Richard caught on, he could issue fines, even pursue legal threats. But we were past the point of fear. The night before the party, I barely slept. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors double-checking details. One text stood out: "He's going to get what he deserves. Don't back down now." The next evening, the cul-de-sac shimmered with string lights and expensive decor. Dozens of cars lined the street: luxury models, catered tables, champagne glasses. It looked more like a corporate gala than a neighborhood event. I watched from my window as Richard gave orders to staff, smiling for photos, completely unaware that his own downfall was already in motion. At that moment, part of me felt nervous, another part felt a strange calm. For months, he'd used fear to control everyone. But fear only works until people stop being afraid. As the night went on, our contact mingled with guests, gathering photos and names. Inside, Richard was giving a speech about transparency and accountability, which almost made me laugh. Meanwhile, one of the neighbors texted me a photo from inside, an open folder on Richard's desk containing invoices stamped paid HOA funds. It was all there. By the end of the night, we had everything we needed: proof of misuse, fraud, and personal enrichment, all neatly documented. And the best part? The news reporter had recorded the entire event, including his speech about ethical leadership. The next morning, I walked outside to grab the paper, and for the first time in months, I felt something shift. The air was heavy but hopeful. Richard had no idea what was coming, because in less than 48 hours, the entire neighborhood and the local media would see who he truly was. But before that moment came, Richard decided to make one last move, a desperate attempt to crush me before the truth could. A letter arrived that afternoon. This time, it wasn't a fine, it was a notice of lien. He'd officially filed paperwork with the HOA to place a lien on my home, claiming repeated and unresolved violations. It was the final straw, the one threat meant to break us. But instead of breaking me, it solidified my resolve. He thought I'd panic. He thought I'd fold under pressure. He had no idea he'd just signed the final piece of his own downfall, because in 48 hours, his entire empire of control would collapse, right in front of the very people he'd spent years intimidating. 2 days after Richard's president's appreciation party, the HOA's monthly board meeting began like any other. But everyone knew this one felt different. The usual crowd of a dozen residents had turned into nearly 50. Even people who'd avoided meetings for years showed up, whispering in the back rows, holding folded letters and phones ready to record. Word had spread. Something big was coming. The air inside the clubhouse was tense. The walls were lined with framed photos of Richard cutting ribbons and shaking hands, his legacy on display like trophies. But tonight, those photos felt like evidence of arrogance, not achievement. Richard sat at the center of the long table, wearing his usual suit and that smug half-smile he reserved for moments when he thought he'd already won. To his right sat 2 board members, both looking uneasy. On the other side, the HOA treasurer, a quiet man named Phil, shuffled papers nervously, avoiding eye contact. When the clock struck 7, Richard tapped his pen against the microphone. Let's begin. First order of business. Community compliance updates. He launched into his usual routine, reading off names, fines, and petty infractions. Unapproved lawn ornaments, excessive trash bin exposure, repeated noncompliance with curb paint regulations. When he reached my name, he paused for effect. Mr. Harris, continued violations unresolved. The board has authorized lien proceedings on your property. He looked straight at me. We take rule enforcement seriously, even when certain residents think they're above it, the room murmured. I could feel eyes on me, pity, fear, maybe curiosity. But I didn't react. Not yet. When he finished, he leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. Before we adjourn, he said, I understand some residents have concerns they wish to address. Let's keep things civil. That was my cue. I stood, holding the thick binder of documents I'd spent weeks compiling. My hands didn't shake us, not this time. I'd been humiliated, threatened, and cornered for months. But tonight I had the truth. Actually, Richard, I said evenly, I do have concerns, specifically about how this HOA has been using member funds, he smirked. Financial reports are reviewed quarterly. You're not authorized to. I have the quarterly reports right here. I lifted a set of printed statements, and they don't match the filings submitted to the county. That got the room's attention. The murmuring stopped. All eyes turned toward the table. I took a step closer. For months, you've been fining residents for meaningless violations while quietly approving invoices paid to a company called Collins Property Events. That company, as county records show, is owned by your wife. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. Richard's smirk faltered for the first time. That's a baseless accusation, he snapped. You have no proof. Oh, I have proof. I opened the binder and began laying out printed invoices, photos, and correspondence, each one marked with HOA letterhead and his signature. $2,800 for catering at last month's community social, $1,500 for security staffing at your appreciation party, another $900 for decorations and event planning, all paid through HOA funds to your wife's company. Want to explain that? He shifted in his seat, his voice rising. Those were approved expenditures by the board. Phil, the treasurer, finally spoke up. His voice trembled. No, they weren't. Every head turned toward him. He looked pale, defeated. I never signed off on those. I asked for receipts, but Richard said he'd handle it internally. I didn't realize the payments were going to his family. Richard slammed his hand on the table. Phil, you're mistaken, but the room wasn't buying it. The whispers turned into open outrage. Someone in the back shouted, "You've been stealing from us!" Another yelled, "You fined me for a mailbox color while throwing yourself parties!" The tension snapped like a wire. I held up one final paper, a printout of the state registration showing Collins' property events under his wife's name, with the same contact email used for HOA business. "This isn't a mistake," I said. "This is embezzlement." Richard's face went red. "You don't know what you're talking about! You think you can come in here with your little binder and slander me? You'll regret this!" But his threats had lost their power. For the first time, he looked smaller, cornered. That's when the door opened, and in walked the reporter. She was calm, professional, holding a press badge and a small recording device. "Sorry to interrupt," she said. "I'm with Channel 9 Investigates. We received reports of financial misconduct within this HOA. Would you like to make a statement, Mr. Collins?" Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room erupted. Residents pulling out phones, snapping pictures, whispering to each other. It was chaos, but the kind that comes when truth finally catches up. I stepped back, letting the scene unfold. Everything we'd planned had worked. Every document, every photograph, every shred of evidence was now in public view. Richard tried to regain control, raising his voice over the noise. "This meeting is over. Everyone out." But no one moved. Instead, Mrs. Daniels, the retired teacher he'd bullied for her garden gnome, stood up. "No, Richard," she said softly. "You don't get to silence us anymore." It was the quietest moment of the night, and somehow the loudest. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak for months began to stand one by one. The Millers, the Garcias, even the timid young couple from Lot 12, each of them holding letters, fines, or warnings they'd received from him, all for absurd reasons. Within minutes, the long table was covered with papers, a sea of proof that his power had never been about fairness. The reporter began filming interviews as Richard stormed toward the exit, muttering threats about legal action. But even his voice sounded hollow now. As he reached the door, I said, "The one thing I'd been holding back since this all began. You tried to destroy families over rules you didn't even follow yourself. Now everyone knows who you really are." He stopped, shoulders tense, but didn't turn around. Then he left, and for the first time in months, the room exhaled. Phil, the treasurer, looked at me. "What happens now?" I nodded toward the reporter. "Now, we let the truth do what it always does." Outside, the night air felt different, calm, free. People gathered in small groups on the sidewalk, talking, laughing, shaking their heads in disbelief. It was like a fog had finally lifted from the neighborhood. But even in that relief, I knew the storm wasn't completely over. The exposure was only the beginning. There would be hearings, resignations, maybe even lawsuits. Yet for the first time, we weren't the ones hiding. Over the next few days, the story exploded. The news segment aired that weekend under the headline, "HOA President Accused of Embezzling Funds from Residents." The footage showed Richard's lavish parties, his wife's event company listings, and even snippets of the heated board meeting. Neighbors who'd once feared the HOA started coming forward publicly. Some admitted they'd paid questionable fines for years. Others shared emails where Richard threatened liens over trivial issues. By Monday, his resignation letter circulated across the community email chain. It was short, defensive, and full of excuses, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Still, part of me couldn't help wondering, if we hadn't fought back, how many more families would he have bullied into silence? The next HOA meeting, held under interim leadership, was packed again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. People laughed, talked freely, and no one looked over their shoulder. When my name came up on the agenda, it wasn't for a violation. It was for recognition. Daniel Harris, the interim president, said, for holding this community accountable when no one else would. The applause that followed wasn't loud or theatrical, it was real, the kind that carries relief and respect in equal measure. But as I looked around, at faces that had once avoided eye contact now smiling, I realized something deeper. This was never just about me or Richard. It was about what happens when power goes unchecked, and what it takes for ordinary people to push back. As the meeting ended, I stepped outside and looked across the street. Richard's house was dark, the once pristine lawn now overgrown, the mailbox stuffed with uncollected letters. His nameplate, HOA President, had been scraped off the signpost. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because at the end of it all, the man who tried to control everyone else had lost control of everything that mattered to him: his reputation, his influence, and the false sense of power that kept this neighborhood afraid. And as I stood there, the cool evening breeze carrying the faint smell of barbecue smoke from a few houses down, I couldn't help but smile. The sound of laughter echoed through the cul-de-sac again, the way it used to, before all of this began. But I knew one thing for certain. This time, it wouldn't be silenced by a clipboard or a threat, because once people taste freedom, they never go back to fear, and Richard Collins was about to learn that the hard way. After the boardroom showdown, our quiet community was never the same. Not overnight, not even in the weeks that followed. But change had begun, slow and undeniable, like spring breaking through after a long, punishing winter. In the days after Richard's resignation, the cul-de-sac was buzzing. People who'd barely spoken to each other for months started talking again. Not in whispers, but in open, confident tones. Kids rode their bikes without the usual scolding about noise ordinances, and the tension that had hung over the neighborhood like fog finally began to lift. For the first time in a long time, people smiled when they walked their dogs. They waved from driveways again. It felt like the community was breathing freely, as if we'd all been holding our breath without realizing it. But underneath the relief, there was a deeper reckoning to come, because Richard's departure didn't erase the damage. It only exposed how deep his control had gone. Within a week, the county audit office got involved. The reporter we'd worked with had shared everything: the invoices, the forged approvals, the conflicts of interest. What started as a neighborhood scandal quickly turned into an official investigation. The HOA's bank statements told a story that even Richard couldn't twist. Thousands of dollars had been rerouted through his wife's company over 2 years. Some of it labeled as community improvements, others as administrative reimbursements, all of it unauthorized. It didn't take long for investigators to trace the funds. The Collins family event business shut down within days of the report airing. Their social media pages vanished. The once confident man who used to stroll the neighborhood with a clipboard now avoided being seen at all. One afternoon, I saw a moving truck parked in front of his house. No one came out to help him. No one waved goodbye. The blinds stayed drawn, the air heavy with the kind of silence that only follows disgrace. He was gone by nightfall. The HOA held an emergency election a few days later. For the first time in years, people volunteered enthusiastically to serve, not out of power hunger, but because they didn't want the community to fall back into fear. Phil, the treasurer, took temporary leadership until the new board could be formed. He was quiet, honest, and deeply remorseful for not speaking sooner. "I thought staying silent would protect me," he admitted during the first open meeting. But silence only protects the wrong people. It was a rare moment of humility, and it set the tone for what came next. The new board's first act was to abolish the fine system Richard had abused. Instead of punishment, they introduced a simple communication model, one that encouraged cooperation rather than intimidation. They called it Neighbor First. If someone had a concern, they'd discuss it face-to-face before sending any notice. It was such a small change, but it transformed everything. The same HOA that once felt like an authoritarian. Watchtower slowly became what it was supposed to be, a group of neighbors trying to make their community better. And yet, the scars remained. For months, people shared their own stories, the fines, the warnings, the humiliation they'd quietly endured. A pattern emerged. Anyone who'd ever questioned Richard or refused to comply with his unnecessary rules had been targeted in one way or another. It wasn't just about control. It was about fear, fear that speaking up would cost you your peace, fear that one man's opinion could take your home. But those stories, once told in hushed voices, now became part of something empowering. Because every confession, every shared memory, reminded us that no one had to face that kind of abuse again. The HOA held a community renewal weekend a month later. Not a party, but a genuine rebuilding effort. Families came together to repaint fences, fix sidewalks, and plant new trees around the park. There were no fines, no inspections, no hidden agendas, just people working side by side again. And when the grills came out for lunch, someone joked, "Hope this BBQ is HOA approved." Everyone laughed. That laugh meant something. It meant the fear was gone. But beyond our cul-de-sac, the story reached further than anyone expected. The Channel 9 segment on HOA corruption spread online, sparking discussions in other neighborhoods, even other states. People began sharing their own experiences with power-hungry HOA boards. From absurd fines to threats over mailbox colors and holiday lights, it was like our little story had opened a door others were waiting to walk through. Some local legislators even cited the case when proposing HOA transparency reforms, pushing for stricter auditing requirements and easier access to financial records. 2. Think. A backyard barbecue had turned into the spark for actual change, and that's when I realized something. It wasn't just about one man's corruption. It was about how easily ordinary people surrender control to someone who claims to know what's best. How slowly we start accepting absurdity as normal until someone finally says, "Enough." For us, that moment came the day Richard tried to ban a family barbecue, the most harmless, human thing imaginable. It wasn't about rules or policies. It was about dignity. When I look back now, I can still remember that day clearly. The smell of charcoal, the laughter, the sound of my kids playing. And how that simple afternoon somehow became the beginning of a fight for something much bigger. The legal aftermath dragged on quietly for months. Richard was eventually charged with misappropriation of community funds and fraudulent accounting practices. The evidence we'd collected, those binders, emails, and invoices, became central to the case. He took a plea deal. Avoided jail, but lost his ability to serve on any board or manage community finances again. Some called it justice. Others said it wasn't enough. But for me, the real victory was watching our neighborhood heal, something no court ruling could ever measure. Richard's house sold within a few months, though the new owners never knew the full story. The only trace of him left behind was a small metal plaque near the clubhouse listing past HOA presidents. His name had been removed, just a blank space where authority once sat. I sometimes walked past it during evening strolls, not out of pride, but as a quiet reminder. Power doesn't corrupt instantly. It erodes, slowly, quietly, when people stop paying attention. And just as easily, it can be reclaimed. Life eventually found its rhythm again. Saturdays returned to their usual rhythm. Neighbors laughing, music drifting softly through backyards, and grills sizzling without fear of inspection. My wife's garden flourished that summer, her flowers spilling over the fence in bright defiance of every regulation Richard once enforced. Even my son, who used to get nervous whenever someone in a suit walked by, started joking about becoming president of fun for the block. We'd gone from silence to laughter, from fear to pride. The kind of transformation no policy or law could ever replicate, because it came from people finally remembering that they were the community. Not the board, not the bylaws, not the signature on a letterhead. A few months later, the HOA hosted its first true community event under the new board, an open cookout at the park. No rules, no permits, just people bringing food, music, and stories. When I showed up with my grill, a few neighbors helped me set up. One of them, the new HOA president, smiled and said, "You know, Daniel, I think this is what a real neighborhood is supposed to look like." I nodded. Took us a while to remember that. That afternoon, I watched kids run through sprinklers, teenagers toss frisbees, and couples relax under the trees. It was everything our community had once pretended to be on paper, now made real by trust instead of fear. And when the smell of barbecue filled the air again, no one complained. No one called it a violation. Instead, they called it home. Months later, when the reporter who'd broken the story reached out for a follow-up, she asked me one simple question: "What made you decide to fight back? Most people just pay the fine and move on." I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "It wasn't about the money," I said. "It was about what happens when good people start believing they can't make a difference. The second you stop questioning unfair power, you give it permission to grow." She smiled and said, "That's powerful. Mind if I quote you?" I shrugged. "Only if it helps someone else realize they don't have to stay quiet either." That line ended up being the closer for her new segment. It played during the evening news, the same slot where Richard's downfall had once aired. Watching it felt surreal. A few neighbors even texted screenshots of the quote on their TVs, but the truth is I didn't say it to sound wise. I said it because I'd lived it. Because when you've been the target of power you didn't ask for, and you've seen how easily it can destroy something as simple as a backyard barbecue, you never forget how fragile peace really is. Even now, years later, every time I fire up the grill, I think about that chain of events. How one afternoon of laughter turned into months of chaos, and how, somehow, it all led to something better. If there's one thing that stayed with me, it's this: you don't need a title or a badge to make a difference. You just need the courage to stand your ground when everyone else stays seated. Because power, real power, doesn't come from rules or authority. It comes from people willing to protect what's right, even when it's inconvenient. Our neighborhood learned that the hard way, but in the end, we learned it together. The fences are still white. The lawn's still neat. And the bylaws still exist, but now they serve us, not the other way around. And every summer, when the scent of charcoal drifts through the air, I see it as a quiet symbol of victory, not just over one corrupt HOA president, but over the fear that used to keep everyone silent. Because no matter how many rules someone writes, no matter how many fines they threaten, there's one thing they can never regulate: the spirit of a community that refuses to bow down. And that's what finally saved us. One barbecue, one truth, one stand.